Yeah. So, as many of you might know, that the proposal to form the United Nations was unveiled in October 1945, and this happened in an international conference, which continued for quite a long time in the United States. And the UN Charter was signed in San Francisco on the 26th of June 1945. So, in the throes of the Second World War, which was still not over, but the discussions were happening. And basically, what had happened during the Second World War, the violence, the mass loss of life, disease, pandemic, all of that went into creating a new imagination about peace, about hope, a new world order. And in that, the United Nations, in that atmosphere, the United Nations was created. Now, when you look at the paperwork, when you look at the official paperwork about the United Nations, what you quickly see is that this charter was signed by about 50 allied nations. I put the term nations in inverted commas because I think it's a problematic one. Sometimes historians, a lot of historians in the past have used the term nationhood without really carefully looking at who signed the charter. So when you look at the signatories, you also find India mentioned, for example. But in 1945, India was not a nation. India was still a British colony, and very much part of British Empire. The call for independence was strong, but India was not independent yet. So in many ways, the signatories of the UN Charter were inflated. Not all were, in technically speaking, nations. And yet, this is also a very powerful demonstration of the power of decolonization, in the sense that, in a way, the international community in 1945 knew that some empires were going to start breaking down, and those broken down bits of empire, like India, for instance, which no one knew what it would look like at that time, needed to be part of the new world order, that it would be an important part of the new world order. We have to remember, of course, that the India that signed this charter in 1947 would be two countries, not just India, but also India and Pakistan. But the idea of Pakistan had not really formed when this charter was signed. And I think that's very significant because it represents a recognition that empire had become a dirty word in the international context. Therefore, they had to use the word nations to avoid the dirtiness of the reference to empire. So the World Health Organization is conceived within this environment that I've just described to you. It was, again, imagined as a new body that would be different from what existed in the past. And its constitution was signed by 61 quote-unquote nations in July 46. Again, when you look at the list, India figures, and India is still not independent. So again, that same feeling of the dirtiness of empire impacts the formation of the WHO as well. Now, the constitution is signed in July 46, but it takes about 2 years for WHO, the World Health Organization, to be formally established. On the 7th of April 1948, we are rapidly approaching the 75th anniversary of the WHO, and the first World Health Assembly is held in July 1948. So again, what I want to highlight to you here is people are trying to talk about only the involvement of nations in the formation of the WHO because they want to distance the formation of this body and the leadership of this body from imperial rule, from imperial impulses. Everyone knows that empires will continue to play an important part because Britain, France, they all wanted leadership roles. Portugal wanted leadership roles in this new organization. But even as these roles were performed, what they wanted to highlight was the role of the nation, not the role of imperial networks. But the other historiographical point to make here is that the WHO and its history are connected with many what I would like to call origin myths, which I would like to discuss here, which I would like to problematize, because I think we need that historiographical problematization. So, many of you will have heard about UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Many historians have written about it. It was formed in 1943 during the Second World War because the dislocation caused by the Second World War needed intervention. So the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration was founded by the Allies. It got a lot of US funding. It was intended to help, displaced populations who were displaced by war to resettle and stuff like that. And in 1945, when the new United Nations was formed, the charter I spoke about in the first slide, UNRWA was blended into the United Nations. It was then downsized and finally closed. And what you start seeing is from 1947 onwards, as discussions are happening about the formation of the WHO, if you look at the unpublished material and also some of the published material, but especially unpublished material, you see negotiations happening within the commission that is discussing the formation of the WHO about some of the budgets from UNRWA moving to the new WHO organization. Now, why is this important? Because only some of the money transferred over. Some of the other money transferred over to UNICEF, some of the other money transferred over to the UN headquarters in United Nations. It was clearly dominated by the US, but in the post-Second World War era, the Allied world was dominated by the US and its economy. But when you look at its charter, again, there's a reference to 44 nations. And again, the nations include imagined nations, which are still not nations, but actually part of empires. But America is beginning to support the decolonizing processes, which, included India, of course, because, a lot of economic historians, for instance, have written about the competition within the Allies for territories that were expected to decolonize after the Second World War. So even during the Second World War, while the Allies were fighting together, they were also competing with each other. And British India was one of those areas where there was a lot of competition because America, basically, the United States of America, wanted access to the British Indian market, British India, independent India. And of course, Britain didn't want to give up its control over the so-called Sterling Zone. And it was, even as it was allying with the USA to fight the Second World War, at the same time, there were other US and British officials who were competing with each other in relation to the Indian market and the Indian economy. So many historians, including our common friends like Marcos Cueto and others, have have suggested that, in a sense, that UNRWA can be seen as a WHO precursor. And there are other people, other historians who have claimed that the health section of the League of Nations should also be considered as a WHO precursor. I question that viewpoint. I question the viewpoint because I would submit to you, I would suggest to all of you, that is a US-centric or a Eurocentric notion. The idea that the League of Nations or the WHO or UNRWA are seen as the forefathers or the foremothers of the, originating point of the WHO. Because I think if you take such an approach, such a US and Eurocentric approach, even if you look at it in complexity as the allies being competing forces, you are still only looking at North America and Western Europe, or possibly, some people are slightly more democratic, but it's always Europe. They also look at Eastern Europe, and they look at these forces as being the main defining force in the formation of the WHO. And that is what I'm trying to question in front of all of you today. So what are the new impulses underpinning the formation of the WHO that I feel are not properly considered in historiography? So one of them, as I've suggested to you, is anti-imperial nationalisms. How do anti-imperial nationalisms play an important part in WHO and the United Nations? So if in 1945 and 1946, India, as quote-unquote nation, is being allowed to sign charters of membership, then it stands to reason that Indian nationalists, not all Indian nationalists, but select Indian nationalists, Hindu and Muslim, are being allowed to play a role, a substantial role in defining what the UN should be and what the WHO should be. Who's this? Emmanuel, I think you're not muted. Can you mute because you're distracting me? Thank you. So anti-imperial nationalisms are very important from the very beginning. And I would argue that, again, apart from one historian, Sunil Amrit, that I can think of, it hasn't really been considered very deeply. Even historians like Alison Bashford, when they talk about Afro-Asian impulses in early WHO, is that mimicry. They don't see it as an independent force. And as I will argue later, that is a problem of historiography and historical approach, not a reflection of the reality of the complexity of politics of the early WHO. Of course, when the new nations are actually formed, when India is formed, when Pakistan is formed, when Indonesia is formed, when Ghana is formed, when Egypt is formed, when Yugoslavia, come together as an alliance, the so-called non-aligned movement. So there are deeper impulses, there are deeper influences of all these countries in the new UN system. So I would argue to you today that the new nations of India, Pakistan, and Ghana and Egypt play an immense role in the formation of what is the WHO. And that ensures that the new World Health Organization that is born in 1948 is something fundamentally different from the League of Nations or UNRWA. There is an innate anti-colonialism that is at the heart of the new WHO that just did not exist in the League of Nations, for example, which had imperialism in its heart. So I would argue that if you look at WHO in a more democratic way as a historian, if you start reading, if you don't presume that its only driving forces are in Washington, D.C., or in London or Paris, and you go beyond the archival files that represent those voices, and then you start focusing your attention. The files exist. I would argue that historians have just not focused on the files that look at African and Asian nations. If you start looking at some of the figures who are beginning to chair different commissions, different panels, even the World Health Assembly, you start actually noticing a lot of brown and black actors, especially brown actors, males and females, who are playing an important role, but the US-centric and US-centric or the Eurocentric historian doesn't look at them because they cannot imagine that these people can play a role. So they always keep looking out for these European and American actors and only write about them, and usually men. So actually, if you look at the decolonizing forces, you will actually start seeing some women leaders as well. India's first health minister, who is immensely important, as I will discuss later, is female. But we don't look at her because in the imagination of many of these historians, how can the Browns play a role? They can't play a role. They're mimics. They only, follow what the Europeans are doing. And as I said, that is actually not a historical problem. That's a historiographical problem that we need to break apart. So what for me is a powerful representation of a more democratic history? The systematic ignoring of the fact that the WHO was fundamentally different in shape from the old League of Nations. The fact that the WHO, unlike the League of Nations, started developing regional offices. The fact that the first regional office was born almost immediately after the WHO was born, and it was not set up in Europe, it was set up in the South Asian subcontinent, in New Delhi, in India. And it was called the WHO Regional Office for Southeast Asia. That is a political term, but it is set up in South Asia. And it is very interesting that the India-Indonesia political alliances that are forming at the time ensure that Indonesia joins the Southeast Asia Regional Office. So there's a political statement being made here. So even now, to this day, Indonesia is part of the Southeast Asia Regional Office in New Delhi, not the Western Pacific Regional Office, where the office is in Manila. So there are political negotiations happening here. The other thing we Eurocentric and Eurocentric historians often ignore is that they keep assuming that it's basically DC, Washington DC, that is the most important power center, and all the orders are coming from there, and basically people are perhaps adapting, but basically listening to US orders, and that is what international and global health is. I question that view as well, and particularly representative of that view is Theodore Brown. Ted Brown cannot seem to go beyond the US-centric notion of WHO ever. For him, power, money. I mean, he's a left-wing historian. His heart is in the right place. He really wants to show how damaging a force the USA wants to be. But often what happens with a lot of left-wing history is that as you're starting to create histories of victimization, you actually disempower the victim in your historical analysis and narratives. You often actually don't look at the agency of Black and brown peoples. You're so busy trying to create narratives of particularly usually white men as evil people that you actually forget the agency and the possibilities of writing histories of actually brown and Black action and the empowerment these people did. And if you studied those, you would find that some of these so-called central good white people and Black white people, usually men that they write about, had actually very little power when it came to Asian Africa, because that is what I've tried to suggest in my title. They look at theory, they don't look at implementation, because the moment you look at histories of implementation, then the brown and Black actors become very important. But what they're talking about is a fight for ideas, a fight for WHO headquarters. But WHO headquarters in Geneva was never supposed to be the nerve center of power, because the WHO was formed out of decolonization, where from the very beginning, it was negotiated that implementation was going to be at the regional level. Headquarters was only going to suggest ideas which they were, by definition, going to be implemented at regional office and country office levels. And there, some of these US-centered people who may have been powerful in relation to having the ear of Washington, D.C. and US governments actually just did not matter in Asia and Africa. Sometimes they mattered, mostly they didn't matter. So a good way to remember that when WHO is formed, it is actually it's deeply marked by anti-colonialism in practice, not just in theory. And that is powerfully demonstrated by the fact that the 14th World Health Assembly was actually held in New Delhi, not in Geneva. We also tend to forget that. What does it say about the early WHO? That, the new countries that are coming out of decolonization actually are beginning to have a lot of power. And why do they have a lot of power? Because it's one country, one vote. So the vote of a small country like independent Sri Lanka, Ceylon it was called, later renamed Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka has as much power in voting in the World Health Assembly as the United States has. It's not as if the United States is richer, more powerful, therefore has 10 votes. It has 1 vote. So does Ceylon. So we have to think about these political processes and the negotiations that are happening. But we must also think about Africa, which decolonized later than Asia. And by the time Africa was decolonizing, what you were seeing is, I would argue in my new work, which is, I don't have as much time as I would like to write these days because of my responsibilities, but at least in my mind, I'm still writing and analyzing. And in my mind, what I talk about in events like this as the recolonization of Asia. So you had decolonization of Asia, where European actors were literally kicked out in some cases, but then the newly independent nations in Asia were becoming colonizers themselves. So Indonesia was beginning to colonize Papua New Guinea and stuff like that. India was beginning to take over Himalayan kingdoms, which had been previously kingdoms, like Sikkim, India. And there were new ideas of nationhood that were colonizing forces on their own, but that's a different matter. In all of this, we have African, quote unquote, subversion. Why do we have African subversion when you look at the unpublished files? Because the WHO African Regional Office, as many of you I'm certain will know, because the first regional director of the WHO Regional Office for Africa was a Portuguese gentleman who was a leading tropical medicine practitioner in Lisbon, who did a lot of work in Africa. African nationalisms often saw the newly formed African Regional Office as a colonial club. It was sub-Saharan in the sense that North Africa was covered by the Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office, where Egypt played a very similar, very powerful decolonizing role as India had played in the Southeast Asia region, along with Indonesia. In sub-Saharan Africa, the WHO Regional Office was seen by African nationalisms, both in North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, as a colonial club. The change started happening when people like Kwame Nkrumah came to power and start pushing for change, which gradually leads to Pan-Africanism having a role in the WHO Regional Office. And here the new organization of African Unity, which results from decolonization, also plays a greater role. And this leads to greater calls for WHO reform in the African region. And before the reform takes place, if one is able to take their eyes away from Eurocentric and US-centric files, what you start seeing is that even before decolonization happens in Africa, African nationalists say we want nothing to do with the WHO regional office because it's colonial. And they start talking because they have visions for health and development. And in those discussions, what they're doing is they're beginning to talk with people in WHO headquarters. And who are they talking to in WHO headquarters during World Health Assemblies, for example? In the hidden offices, in the corridors, in the hidden offices, some hidden offices in the WHO office, they're beginning to talk. And, what you see is when you look at political reports, when you see reports of secret reports or secret meetings that are happening, they're often talking South-South. They're talking to Indonesian compatriots, they're talking to Indian compatriots, they're talking to Sri Lankan compatriots. But very interestingly for me, they're also talking to Americans secretly. Because, as the decolonization process is happening, those decolonizing from French rule or Portuguese rule want closer links often with the United States, who they see as the bigger power. But in all of these discussions, the US policy is to empower African nationalisms, but also weaken European imperialisms. And this is something we have to remember. So if you keep the power of the decolonizing nationalisms in mind, and then you connect that to the power of the decolonized countries like Egypt, India, and Indonesia in mind, it should therefore not be a surprise for a decolonized historian to then better understand how in the WHO and in the World Health Assemblies, there is organized opposition to South Africa and even Portugal. The civil wars in Africa resulted in a situation where these newly decolonized countries would come together and start voting against imperial powers, including Portugal, and successfully get them disbanded, barred from the World Health Assembly, for instance. It's a history that is worth studying in greater detail. But let me quickly use 3 case studies to further go deeper into the points I'm making. So if I use malaria eradication as my first case study, it is true that the initial plans were based on work done in Europe after World War II. And it is also true that one of the organizing principles of the MAP, the Malaria Eradication Program, was the DDT, which was seen as a magic bullet. That bit I don't contest. But I do contest Eurocentric and US-centric notions of the call for malaria eradication. Yes, US interests, often backed by Rockefeller scientists and researchers, and the Rockefeller Foundation playing a role from the background, had an important role to play in the WHO calling for worldwide malaria eradication in 1955. I cannot contest that. But I would suggest that call would not have been successful unless the support of countries like India and Indonesia and Egypt had been mobilized. And that mobilization was not because America ordered India. In fact, if America had ordered India at that point of time, it would have had the opposite effect. India would most probably have opposed. As we can see, even now, these trends continue. Even now, when India is supposedly pro-America, but India is still not blindly following America's approach to Ukraine, for instance. And these trends are long-term. These are historical trends. As we all know, malaria eradication was initially considered successful. And those initial gains, those figures, that data that allowed people to call it a success, was initially coming from South Asia, that is India, particularly India and Sri Lanka. And also the first reports of DDT resistance and then the returning surge of malaria, that data was also coming from Asia and usually Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, parts that had been that were part of sort of the Francophone empire in Asia. Now, it is true that the malaria eradication program was quite vertical in the sense that it was top down. But then again, implementation was always done vertically. And we must never forget that. So even when the malaria eradication program was considered to be failing and then was called off by WHO in 1969, we should never forget that some countries continued the WHO eradication program. Just because WHO and the US said, okay, we're calling it off, it continued. It continued in countries like India, in countries like Bhutan, in countries like Nepal. And again, what I'm submitting to all of you is if we have too US-centric or too Eurocentric a notion of WHO, we then ignore the exceptions to the rule. And there are big, big exceptions. I mean, India is a massive exception. If India does not stop work on malaria eradication, it should matter, but it doesn't matter because too many historians are just too US and Eurocentric, and they think, oh, because US and Europe have said, oh, let's stop malaria eradication, it must have stopped, because in Europe and America control the, call the shots, and it doesn't matter what your political position is. If you're liberal and you think, US is a force of good, even then you believe that, they're calling the shots and everyone is blindly following them. But even if you're left wing and you think US is the sort of, is a malign force, a negative force, even there in those narratives, you're just believing that because US has ordered it, other countries have stopped on malaria eradication programs. I'm challenging that worldview. I'm trying to show you that if you have a more democratic perspective, then you can have an alternative decolonized history, even of malaria eradication. So I've done a lot of work, as many of you will know, on smallpox eradication. That is how I developed this decolonized perspective. If you look at the US CDC notion of smallpox eradication, for them, history of smallpox eradication started in West Africa in the mid-1960s when the US CDC got involved. For them, there was no history before that. But then again, if you start looking at Indian narratives or Indonesian narratives or Egyptian narratives, a decolonized perspective of smallpox eradication, you will see claims that it started in India. And it didn't just start in India after independence. In relation to smallpox, it's an uneasy history. But, Indian nationalists will accept that actually smallpox vaccination was quite strong in British India. And then some people might argue that it was an attempt to colonize bodies and, it was part of the, the whole idea of doing good to control minds, and vaccination was part of that. But it was more complex than that. There was huge investment in smallpox vaccine production and vaccination in newly independent countries, because it was one way in which newly independent countries could show that they were making a difference in the territories that they had begun to control. But the US narrative, the US CDC narrative, that smallpox eradication was again US-centric. When you look at US CDC as a center of the world, that whole idea is based on a transfer of idea thesis, that it had to involve about 1,000 white American officials who go off to the darkest parts of Africa. They find solutions. And the world can only start thinking about smallpox eradication when supposedly these 1,000 people who are the only ones who have brains start thinking about smallpox eradication. And I refuse to accept that narrative, because when I study my archives in a decolonized way, I can see that for every 100 Americans, about 10,000 brains, black and brown brains, working on the idea of how to prevent smallpox, and that the history of smallpox eradication is much, much longer than the US CDC's institutional histories would have us believe. But I would go further. I would actually say that the ideas the US CDC claims are not just even American ideas. There are local ideas that are at play, because when, let's say these 1,000 American CDC officials go in, they actually don't know Africa very well at all. Even their so-called leaders like Bill Figge, who are very big figures in contemporary global health, are actually learning a lot on the ground from people like Grant from Ghana, from what was called the Gold Coast, and then Ghana, Frank Grant. The point is that the US CDC officials don't write about how much they've learned from people like Frank Grant. And therefore, the US-centric historians who look at US-centric sources think Frank Grant don't exist. People like Frank Grant don't exist. But they did exist. And they did write their memoirs. And they did make a difference. If historians ignore the voices and the memoirs and the memories and the official files written by Black leaders like Frank Grant, or brown leaders like M.I.D. Sharma, whose problem is that? That's a problem of historiography. That's a problem of the racist historian, not the lack of evidence. The evidence is there. Historians systematically ignore the evidence. So that's why I call it a historiographical problem. So that's why I think the local histories of implementation of widely varying smallpox eradication national programs is very important. It is very important to study reports in languages other than English or French or Spanish, beyond the UN languages. You can do that quite easily in the archives by looking at reports that are not written in the UN languages, that are then translated into UN languages. And if you sit down with collaborators and then you look at the act of translation, what you're seeing is that as the documents are being translated, I call it lost in translation in my classes, as these reports are being translated, these ground reports are being translated from, let's say, 20 or 30 Indian languages into English. Silences are being worked into the English documents, where certain actors are being airbrushed out of these reports, and the claim is being made for success on the basis of a smaller number of ideas, mainly white, but also some brown leaders who the white people like, not the actual leaders on the ground. So decolonizing work in histories of eradication, smallpox or malaria, can be done by looking at multiple voices that are often not expressed in European languages, in UN languages. And that requires big collaborative teams where you can draw in a lot more languages to get those perspectives. And that, sadly, just does not happen in Eurocentric and US-centric historiography. So this is what I want to underline to you, that there is an ongoing tyranny of what I call institutional histories, that there is too much institutional worship. This is the first US CDC book on smallpox eradication, and there's just too much institutional worship of the US CDC. In fact, in this book, even the role of the WHO is downplayed. What is not recognized, for instance, is that many of these American officials would not have been allowed to go into parts of the world if they had not been given secondments to WHO. They could not often enter India as US officials. India was on the other side of the Cold War. India didn't want American officials. So the only way American officials could often get into India to do smallpox eradication work was to be given a WHO, a UN diplomatic passport via the WHO, which would allow them to be seen as WHO secondees, representatives of WHO, that would then allow them to go into the India. Something we often forget how important the WHO is, because it enables what I like to call peace bridges to be created. That is, even in countries like India, where there was deep suspicion of US motives and US politics, the WHO created the bridges that allowed these Cold War tensions to be overcome, and people from both sides of Cold War tensions, and even the non-aligned movement, which was a third movement, to come together, discuss ideas, and then, with all these ideas coming together, implement policies that were culturally acceptable and politically acceptable in complex countries like India. And that was, I argue, the basis of smallpox eradication. Not the ideas of the few, but the actions of the many working together. Again, we have to remember all these points when we use biographies as source material. Some biographies are deeply, deeply exclusionary. Some biographies written by US officials who played a role in smallpox eradication just do not remember Black and brown participants. That doesn't mean these Black and brown participants don't exist. All it means is that some of these white folk are being deeply elitist and careless and perhaps racist in ignoring what they learned from Black and brown actors. And it has to be called out for what it is. It's exclusionary. They try to manufacture consent. They try to manufacture the idea of excellence. They try to show that only people like them or people who look like them have the ideas that can make progress possible. They consciously, in this process of manufacturing consent, ignore the role of people who don't look like them, who don't speak like them, who speak other languages. So biographies can be deeply exclusionary forms of history that we have to be aware of. It is these very people who then raise money because they live in rich countries and create new archives, some online. And these archives are also exclusionary because they only interview people who look like them, talk like them, are in the same club as them, who work with them, but never the people who actually implemented on a day-to-day basis. If there were 1,000 US officials active globally in the smallpox eradication program, I would argue there were hundreds of thousands of African and Asian officials involved in the smallpox eradication program too. But they don't get represented in these online archives. Maybe one or two people who had a drink with them or a friend or who wrote nice reports about the American officials, they get a look in, but not the critics. No, the critics or anyone who, often people who taught them things. Oh, we can't interview them. What if people find out we knew nothing about India when we went to India, when we had to learn from these other people? Because these people like to present themselves as gods who knew it all, who civilize others, never learn from others. So there is this racism, this racial superiority that you see in the manufacturing and the creation of archives that we also have to be aware of. And in all of this, there is a dominance of the English language. And I say that with full self-reflectivity and humility. Today, I'm speaking to you in English because it is my problem that I don't know Portuguese. I would love to speak to you in Portuguese. I'm not very good with languages. That's why I collaborate so widely. I draw in people who bring in other languages that I can learn from. But English is dominant, and I don't have to say that to this in narrative making and history making. And therefore, it is important that we question that and we look at other voices and narratives. One major figure that I'd like to highlight to all of you, and anyone who's interested can do a real service to the historiography of smallpox eradication, is Claudio Amaral, who was a Brazilian official who worked and served with much distinction in both South Asia, India and Bangladesh, and then later Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa. He has donated all his papers to Fiocruz, and his collections are there, and it's mainly in Portuguese. And there is a history to be written about people like Claudio Amaral. So what is the impact of the tyrannies of historiography that I've just spoken about? This is the woman I was talking about. That's Amrit Kaur, India's first health minister, longest serving health minister, who played an immense role in the formation and the running of the early WHO, both at headquarters level and at regional office level. She is standing alongside India's first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who also, people often forget, was not just prime minister, he was also India's first foreign minister. He always linked India ruling a resurgent new India with India's influence abroad. Not too different from what Lula, for instance, did in Brazil, where Brazil's foreign policy was an integral part of its internal policy as well. You know, it was a very similar political process. So what the tyrannies of historiography does is that it encourages a largely top-down analysis. WHO is mainly seen as WHO headquarters. You know, normative standards are created, you know, about science, you know, what is good science, what is bad science, what is success, what is failure. Those definitions are often based on who is defining that science. The Eurocentric or the North American-centric, the Eurocentric historian often unquestioningly accepts that normativeness on the basis of where that definition is coming from. Just unconsciously, oh, that must be good science because, you know, it was that American actor, that Western European actor who said that. The fact that there is scientific adaptation, that there are alternative notions of science in low and middle income countries, in decolonized countries, in decolonized context, in newly independent countries, is just not studied. The fact that a newly independent India often had deep scientific exchanges with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, where ideas and policies were often created through collaborations that were happening in India, for instance. They just don't get a look in because these people couldn't possibly have done anything good because Western European scientists were not involved, American scientists were not involved. Or people don't even go and look for those papers because they don't know these other relationships exist. Or, you know, they're not publishing in the top European and American journals, so it can't possibly be right, you know, can't possibly be high quality science because, you know, these alliances don't result in papers in the Lancet or the British Medical Journal. But the point remains that these discussions are happening. These discussions are having an impact on the planning of public health. These discussions of science are having an impact on implementation. That adaptive implementation is resulting in ground level successes, including smallpox eradication or polio eradication in a country like India, but they don't get reported on whenever there isn't a white, usually man, involved in these actions and discussions. You know, American and European historical reportage of work usually only happens when there's a white person hovering around in the story. Simply put, many white historians don't seem to think there's a story to tell if there are no white people around. I'm calling it as it is, but as someone who's getting older and older, these habits are beginning to trouble me because these habits are being passed on by PhD supervisors to PhD students and shouldn't be happening, but they're happening. But now, because I'm seen as being successful in a British institution, I can say these things and they're being noted because I'm saying them. Shouldn't be that. It should be visible anyway. but I suppose I'm one of the few who speak so bluntly about these matters, and I have to, because it's a problematic issue. So having shocked you by saying all of this, I have to highlight the fact that, we shouldn't say that our excuse is that we study intellectual history, therefore, we're high-flying intellectuals who only study other intellectuals. We're studying a few people, but sure, study a few people, not a problem. I have no problem with that. My problem is that a lot of people seem to think that brown and black people don't have an intellect. Just because they don't write in English, they don't write in French, or they choose not to write in English and write in French, and they're writing in other languages. Do not create narrow definitions of who has intellect, who doesn't have intellect. Perhaps it is a time now to redefine. And there are many historians who are beginning to challenge through the decolonization of global health process, this idea that intellectualism only exists in North America and Western Europe. What we need to promote, what I'm calling out to all of you to do, is to study the multi-directional flow of ideas. It happened, it's just not been written about. And because we don't have multiple languages, most of us, your language skills are better than mine because you speak English, I don't speak Portuguese. You are much better off than me. But, to study the multi-directional flow of ideas, we need collaborations where people bring in multiple languages. Collaboration is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. We need to stop looking at ourselves as lone wolves who need to work alone. Isn't it much more fun working with groups of people who can bring in many more languages? That is what I would like to propose to you. And if we do that, if we look at the multi-directional flow of ideas, I would submit to you that the world would be much more interesting. We would not then willfully ignore WHO's many complexities. And the complexities that today, I hope I've shown you, excite me. The history of decolonization, of democratization, of anti-imperialism that left a deep mark on the WHO, which is why I, to this day, support the organization a lot. Even though it's not the same organization as it was in 1948, I still think it is one of the most democratic, most hope-giving institutions in the world, where still a tiny country like Bhutan and the United States, with all its power, have only one, their votes are equal in the World Health Assembly. So if I ask all of you, so who is who? I would suggest, and I've said this in Lisbon once before, and I think some people got very angry, but it doesn't matter. Clearly, I was getting my point across. When you answer that question that I ask you, who is the who? Who is the WHO? The answer will reveal more, I submit to you, about the historian or the social scientist who is answering the question rather than the past. Meaning, if your answer is, oh, the WHO is a broad-ranging organization where people work not just in Europe, but also in Asia and Africa, then I would suggest your bent of mind is more democratic. But if you then come back to me and say, no, the WHO is Geneva, nothing else. And then, within Geneva, I'm only looking at higher income country people because they contribute the most to the WHO. So for me, that is the WHO. Then I suggest to you, anyone who gives me that answer, that you have a serious problem that you need to look into and get rid of as soon as possible. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.